The intellectual dark web is a name given to a group of alternative media personalities, from Joe Rogan to Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. Could it also be a spontaneous emergence of a new and more highly evolved level of consciousness into the media landscape? That's what the integral philosopher Ken Wilber believes, and it's something he's been predicting since the 90s. Ken Wilber had serious health problems for the last decade, but is now returning to the conversation. He believes that the intellectual dark web is the start of a genuinely next level or integral conversation. One that lets go of the ideology and fixed thinking of the past and can embrace paradox and nuance.
These stages apply to an enormous number of different skills, and so you can have dozens of different names for these stages and it can get confusing. So one of the things we do is just give them colors. So the previous ethnocentric stage we call amber, and then this orange, rational, world-centric, universal care stage we call orange. Those two stages, amber, ethnocentric, conventional, traditional, and then this new orange, universal rights, these started to arise again during the Western Enlightenment. With the 60s, that new stage of world-centric development tended to emerge, and that's what we call green, or it was multicultural. So it wasn't just a belief in individuality and its freedom. There's a lot of different opinions about postmodernism on the intellectual dark web. In general, nobody likes it. My point, some things we can talk about, is that a lot of it really is off the wall, extreme, bad, however you want to think about it. But that it also had a core of some true, if very partial, notions. And those truths were initially what actually helped to drive that stage of development. And it did start to call itself postmodern because it was reflecting on the previous modern stage of orange, liberal, rational, universal care, individual liberty, freedom of speech. It reflected on all of those, intended to have sort of a critique of those. But it's still having trouble finding ways to actually integrate them. And so it tends to take a stance that believes in radical egalitarianism. And so its version of equality is unlike the previous orange version of equality. Orange's version is liberty and freedom of opportunity. For green and its egalitarianism, it wants equal outcome. And this becomes enormously conflictual because they don't get along well at all, for starters. And given the fact that the original orange equality actually meant freedom of opportunity, Orange's version of equality was often just called freedom. It was in favor of the freedom of individuals. Whereas Green's version of equality is equal outcome, and so it tended to just be called equality or equity. And so you had freedom and equality. And Alex de Tocqueville was one of the first to point out that because human beings are born with different capacities, then you can have either freedom or equality, but you can't have both. And that's exactly right.
You could almost frame this as the division between classical liberalism and postmodernism, that a lot of people, like the intellectual dark web, are really fighting hard on behalf of classical liberalism.
That's exactly right. And one of the things that happen as you go back and look at this original right and left distinction, and again, there are several ways that those can be defined, but one of the ways that they can be defined does have to do with these stages of development. I'm not disagreeing with the other ways. Jonathan Haidt has a particular description of it. Jordan Peterson gives at least two definitions of left and right, one based on big factor analysis. Progressives tend to be more open, and conservatives tend to be more conscientious, particularly suborder, subtype order. And he also sees hierarchies of competence as necessary, and so the right tends to support those, but any sort of hierarchies tend to generate inequality, and so the left hates that and tries to tear those down. So you need both of those interacting. I agree with all of that. But there's also a factor that you see left and right as you track these stages of development, and particularly going from the original amber ethnocentric into orange freedom world-centric into green equality world-centric. And so we started out, we had the original traditional right, tends to be ethnocentric, and again, it can be a bit racist and a bit sexist, and it's not embarrassed about those. It's fine with that. It thinks that's the way it should be. And then you have orange, which was the original liberal philosophy of individual rights and rights for all, universal individual rights. And that really was profound. That got rid of slavery. That, there's an enormous number of changes that happened with that. And then we moved up to the green multicultural, which was really post-liberal, and in many cases became anti-liberal. It doesn't really like free speech. It doesn't really like individual rights. It wants group rights, group identity. It's very willing to curtail free speech, or even on the other hand, compel free speech in order to serve social justice ends. And that infuriates an enormous number of people on the dark web, and I think rightly so. So what started to happen is that as the original left, which started this orange individual equal opportunity, as I don't know exactly how many of them, but I'm going to say about half of them as progressive bumped up to the new green, starting in the 60s. The other half stayed with the original liberal left values. But now you had an old left and a new left. The right, essentially, given this new stage that had been added, it bumped up a stage too, or half of it did. So the old original right stayed at ethnocentric, including in its extremes white supremacists, Nazis, fascists. But then the other half bounced up to orange. And they actually started inhabiting the values of the traditional liberal. But these were now being embraced by people on the right. And so what you see in the intellectual dark web as the Democrats continue to move into this multicultural, egalitarian, green equity movement is that those progressives were leaving behind the original liberal values, including things like free speech. Whereas the people that had become vocal supporting those liberal values were now people from the right. They were new rights. They were Republicans that were doing that. And Weinstein, for example, Brett, I think, says, I'm flabbergasted at the fact that the right is now holding the values that as a leftist I grew up believing. And almost all the people on the intellectual dark web, including Dave Rubin, Jordan Peterson, will say, I'm a classic liberal. And it's not that they're at orange. Most of them, you're actually at second tier. The second tier is the stage that can integrate literally all of the first stages. But what's getting left out is you have this green multicultural egalitarianism that's being taken to such extremes, it's really becoming absolutistic in its view. So you have absolutistic to multiplistic to relativistic. And the problem with relativistic is it becomes very open to what's called performative contradictions. It becomes very open to self-contradictory statements. It does it almost all the time. So it'll maintain, for example, that it is universally, undeniably true that there is no universal truth. It'll maintain that all knowledge is social construction. It's all an interpretation. It all depends upon which culture it's arising in. And yet everything that I just said that represents the green point of view, it maintains that its view is not culturally constructed. It's true for all people at all places at all time. It's not a matter of interpretation. It's got real truth. Nobody else has truth because objective truth doesn't exist. But that view itself is held to be objectively true by the postmodernists. So they do get caught up in this enormous kind of contradiction. And they do tend to absolutize their view. There are two ways you can end up at absolutistic beliefs. One is that you're just on your way up through the growth stages yourself, and you're at that stage. And people, by the way, can stay at that stage for the entire adult life. The fact that we have higher stage doesn't mean that you have to develop there. It's one of the problems. But so they'll have that absolutistic view just because they're on the way of passing through it. But if at any higher stage you latch onto a view with such absolute, uncritical absolutism, you can start to regress to the actual absolutistic stage. Because that's where you feel right. That's where you feel, yeah, this is, I know I've got it right, this is it. So you end up regressing to an absolutistic, ethnocentric stage. And the problem with that is that it is ethnocentric. It is tribal. And identity politics lends itself to tribalism, because what you're emphasizing is your particular tribe. And you'll know if you're doing that from a world-centric stance, if when you talk about your tribe, in addition to whatever important differences there are, you also talk about what your tribe has in common with all the other tribes, then that's world-centric. There's a unity in diversity with that. But if you just talk about your tribe and how it's different from all the other tribes, and is there some sort of special attention, that's ethnocentric, absolutistic tribalism. And so what we have is original far-right ethnocentric tribalists being joined by the really highly developed progressive green identity politics that have regressed to that absolutistic, re-tribalized stage.
Which of those two do you think is more dangerous right now?
Well, that depends in a sense on what community you look at. The intellectual dark web is mostly alarmed by the fact that the far right, and by the way, even the not many of them have an actual developmental framework to interpret it with, they still intuitively understand this stuff. And so I think it was Majid Nawaz that first began referring to the far left as the regressive left. And that's what they were intuiting, is that this left is actually regressing back down to this ethnocentric, absolutistic stage. And the concern for them, from Jonathan Haidt to Jordan Peterson to Dave Rubin, is that college campuses are now overrun, and academia itself is overrun by believers in this absolutistic, green, multicultural, egalitarian identity politics. And they're doing it so much they really are tending to regress to absolutistic stages. And so at absolutistic stages, you don't even have to talk to the other person, because your tribe is right, you know your tribe is right, anybody that disagrees with you is Hitler. And what's so bizarre is that we used to look at the far right for that kind of absolutistic insanity. Now we're getting it from the far left. That's exactly what, it's like, what the hell happened? How did that occur? And that regression back down to a retribalized, polarized stance, that's part of the horrifying problem that we're now facing in culture wars. And that's one of the main things that's driving it. So the only value that was getting left out as you had these regressive, well, as you had the normal far right and the regressive far left, is so green was down to amber and amber was at amber, and there was just orange sort of hanging out there by itself. It had old Democrats who would really no longer speak up for that because the new democratic orientation is multicultural, egalitarian, identity politics. And so the old traditional liberals and the Democrats don't have much of a say. It is, again, Republicans that are now voicing support for individual rights, free speech, and so on. The concern is that far right hate groups are a very real concern in the culture. And very few IDW people would deny that. But their concern is the way it's moving into academia and simply sort of taking over that entire area. Many of the people that belong to the intellectual dark web at one time started out as leftists. And they were leftists when left meant orange liberal. And then as left started to move into this illiberal egalitarianism and identity politics, the original Democrats, the original leftists looked at it and said, I don't recognize that party anymore. Something's wrong with that. And so most conspicuously, somebody like Dave Rubin will actually, have a whole public conversion and say, why I'm no longer a member of the left. And what they mean is this green, extremist, far left, regressive stance, the regressive left. And that's really, really a problem.